all of the land use and land cover change data sets and that representation in CSM is work that I've been sort of working on for the last 10 years. I've been working with lots of other people, obviously, but what I'll do is just go through and Dave and Will both gave good talks, good introductions to the importance of land use and land cover change. So I'll start off. So I'm Peter Lawrence. I'm a project scientist in the terrestrial sciences section up at the Climate Global Dynamics Laboratory. I've been at NCAR since 2008, so I've been involved in various incarnations of the model, and basically going back to CCSM2 when I first started in 2004 at the University of Colorado. So Dave put this slide up yesterday, and I really like this slide because it's why do we sort of think about the land and what's important of land use and land cover change. And so the land is this critical interface where we're studying both climate and climate change impacts on humans and all the activities that they do, as well as natural ecosystems, like terrestrial ecosystems. But as we change the property and the nature of the land and the fluxes and basically the hydrology of the land surface, we have these impacts back on both ecosystems, but also on the larger environment and climate. So being able to capture those elements of humans' impact on the world and on the carbon cycle is really, really valuable for understanding the bigger picture of how the human footprint and impact on the planet, both historically and projected into the future. Okay, and that slide was supposed to have transitioned. Okay, so we can go back. Nope. All right, so this was, I can go through here because I have the slide again up here. Sorry. Gee, that was the slide I wanted to put up. And basically this was put up by Dave and by Will yesterday. And so looking at land cover change and land use. And so what we can see is this gray bar at the top is the fossil fuel emissions. And it's not really until the 1950s that we actually kick in where fossil fuels become greater than land use and land cover change. And if we look at the total amount of carbon that's been emitted, it's about a third of the carbon of all emissions. What's really nice is we can see the offset from the land sink as we've got increasing CO2. We're also getting regrowth from land use and land cover change. So as forests have been harvested for wood production and or land is abandoned and it regrows, we have this land sink growing that takes carbon back out of the emissions that we've put out in the atmosphere. Let's go back. Sorry, now I have to go all the way back, but okay, so this is the basic breakdown of the emissions sort of at 2018 from the Global Carbon Project. And we can see that, you know, a third of all those emissions that went into the atmosphere from human activities. So we have fossil fuel CO2 emissions equivalent of about 440 petagrams of carbon or gigatons of carbon. And then land use is about like half of that amount. So like a third of all the total carbon amounts. What's also really interesting is seeing this terrestrial sink here is around about 195 petagrams of carbon. So it almost offsets our land use. So what we're seeing is that like we have these two components of the land. So the land ends up becoming almost neutral because we've disturbed it, as opposed to how much carbon it would have taken up if we hadn't done all that land use and land cover change. There's also the biogeophysical impacts. So one of the things is when we clear forests in snow-covered areas, like we can see here, we have a very different radiation balance than will be seen if we were to have had the darker trees. So there's this cooling effect from land use, land cover change at high latitudes. But we also impacting the surface roughness and the hydrology. So we have these competing components that are, so in tropical areas, the changes in the hydrological cycle and the roughness mean that we get actually strong warming from deforestation. And there's this nice study from Deborah Lawrence, one of my colleagues, who went through all the literature and looked at, well, what is the net warming versus cooling of land use and land cover change by latitude and by climatic area? And you can sort of see that at the tropical sort of in the tropics, we have this strong warming from deforestation. But as you get sort of further up through to the higher latitudes, we end up with cooling from deforestation. And I remember, I think it was Dave said, you know, he had those sort of categorizations and saying it's a bad idea to be doing reforestation and afforestation at high latitudes because there's a warming component as well. So we've got to be very strategic about what we're doing in terms of land use and land cover. So getting back to this, and you've seen this before, this is like, how do we represent the heterogeneity and the changes in distributions of vegetation and land use? So because we have this discretization of the whole land surface, the global planet into grid cells, we want things that are represented at much finer resolution than can be put at those coarse grid cell resolutions. So we break the land up into these land units. And then below the land unit, we have soil columns. And below the soil columns, we have plant functional types and crop functional types. And so every year, we can change the distribution of this, this hierarchy. And we can change it both at the land unit level, but also at the plant functional type and crop functional type level. We can do things like we can have the same crop, so we have corn, but we can change the amount of irrigated versus rain-fed. We can change the amount of fertilizer that's being applied at that level too. Okay, so on top of that, we do for all the tree plant functional types, we can do wood harvest. So that means we can go in there and we can take large amounts of carbon out, and this is typically done, a certain fraction of the trees get harvested. So all the carbon that was in the wood goes into wood products, and then so the leaves and sort of some of the byproduct ends up as litter and coarse woody debris in the model. So that can then be available to break down. So we have two pools for wood products, one which is like takes 100 years to decay, the other one that takes on average about 10 years to decay. And that depends on what sort of products are being produced, and that will be depending on what type of trees we had to start with. On the other side, for land use and land cover change, we have the crop model. So we prescribe out each of these different crop types globally, where they are, and that changes from year to year. And we say, well, how much is on irrigated versus rain-fed? And then we have for each crop in each grid cell, for each year, how much fertilizer gets applied in this particular grid cell. So we have to apply that. As we talked about yesterday, the actual growing season, the phenology, the life cycle of like the plants are dependent on growing degree days. But we are now looking at crop calendars as an alternative. So you could switch in and say, I prefer to say, I know when this crop is going to be planted. I know when it will be harvested. So we can do those as sort of more prescriptive elements. Okay, so how do we go about building all this information? Because this is a lot of information to be describing, like, you know, globally, every year, every grid cell, you know, we have like all this breakdown. So we, one of the things that I built was this land use data tool. And so what we do is we take these historical future land use time series, which are part of the coupled model in comparison project, which is one subset of that was the land use model in comparison project that Dave Lawrence and I were both part of. And so this describes out the shared understanding of historical land use and land cover change that we then have to put into the plant functional types, crop functional types, and the fertilizer and irrigation that our model will understand. So what does this look like? Well, we actually, and what sort of time series do we look at? So because we're doing within CMEP6 transient Holocene, we took this back to 6,000 years before Common Era to have a starting point. And then we annually looked at changes in the vegetation distributions, the agricultural production. And so here you can see at the top, the actual global distribution of trees in terms of millions of kilometers, square kilometers. And so you see there's very little actual change in trees for like the first few thousand years through this time period. But then we get to around about zero Common Era, and we see the sudden sort of slow decrease in tree cover as we're doing deforestation, an increase in cropping area in the bottom left here. If we go to the historical period, which is sort of here on the right, we see this much rapid, and so you can see the time difference on the x-axis is quite a large sort of like amount of time here. So we have this rapid decrease in tree cover as we deforest the world. We have an increase in this cropping area. And then we look at all these future scenarios. So we have different scenarios based on reforestation scenarios for SSP 126, which was it's considered the, I guess that's the conservative sort of more optimistic presentation of we have a low rate of forcing and we look at environmental management and we have all these other concerns. Versus say SSP 370, which is where the red line, we have this massive increase in deforestation, the continuing deforestation, increase in crop area, increase in pastures. So we can see these different potential futures and what they look like. So that's one element. So you can sort of see got the tool here, we've got these time series, but how does this data get put together? So what we're using is like from the current era, we use a lot of satellite products, inventory data, and bring it together with climate data, soils data. We have leaf area index and albedo that we bring into this component as well. And we bring all this data together And so that we know what the current day looks like. And then we have to reconstruct going back in time, what the potential vegetation distributions look like. And going forward in time, we have to say, well, if you were to do afforestation, what would that look like? What sort of trees would you plant? So that all gets covered and built into this tool system here. And there is a tech note that I've written for this. So it's like about 350 pages long that goes through all the data sets, the methods, and what this looks like. So that's available if you want to, and we can talk about it. It hasn't actually been released yet, but it'll be released next couple of months. Okay, so now you see all the data sets, you think about, okay, well, we've got all this information that's driving our model. And as our model goes forward in time, it's changing. We change the distribution of vegetation. So as we cut down a forest, that carbon either goes into wood products or goes back in the atmosphere through deforestation fires, or ends up as litter products that then decay. So we want to capture and understand, well, what's that impact on the global carbon cycle? So what we can do is we can run the model in different configurations. So we can, in this case here, I'm looking at the historical period, and we're starting here in 1850. And in the red line, we have land use and land cover change, all those time series that I just explained to you and how that sort of fed through. And we'll put this out and show that this loss of carbon and then return to actually having a take up of carbon from like the 1960s onwards is what we experience, what we've actually sort of determined from a lot of our observational record, the Moa Loa records, those sorts of things. But we can do the alternative and say, well, what would happen if we had no land use, land cover change, and we just left the world as it was in 1850, and we still had the same fossil fuel emissions, so carbon dioxide uptake, changes in climate? What happens then? And we can do those two simulations and then compare them. And so what you can see, if without land use and land cover change, we have this big drawdown of carbon as the forests are responding to the elevated CO2 and increases in nitrogen deposition from fossil fuel emissions. So we have about 142 petagrams of carbon gets taken up in a world where we don't do land use. But in the world where we do land use, we lose this 40 petagrams of carbon and say, well, okay, that means that we can then attribute back that difference between the two back to the land use and land cover change that was in the model. So, and that's around about like 142 petagrams of carbon. That sort of comes, sorry, wait a sec, global estimates 100. So 182 petagrams of carbon, whereas a lot of the global estimates are around about 160 petagrams of carbon for the same time period. So we're in the same ballpark as a lot of the other models in the Global Carbon Project. One of the nice things about having a model is you can actually start doing attribution back to, well, which activities are contributing to the land use and land cover change. And here we have the concept, the conversion flux, which where we're doing deforestation, as opposed to wood harvest fluxes where you're going in, taking carbon out, but you're leaving as a forest. It's just now a forest that's been like logged and then sort of regrows. And so we have these two components that we have represented. And you can see they're both roughly about 60 petagrams of carbon. But you can also look at other things, such as, well, how does fire differ between a world where you've got land use versus one where there's no land use? And because the model has deforestation fires in it, and also because you're changing the world so that you've got savannas in places where you potentially could have had forests beforehand, a world with land use and land cover change actually ends up with a lot more carbon being released through fire than one without land use and land cover change, which is interesting because you've got more carbon in the no land use world in terms of total ecosystem carbon, but the activities are causing more fires. And that's around about another 60 petagrams of carbon. We can also look at our crop model and say, well, how much of the food that we produced got taken out of the ecosystems and put in as food production that then got released back into the atmosphere through all the processes of whether it's like eating the food and it goes through the whole sort of waste system. But we can see that the actual amount of food produced by the changes in cropping areas and fertilizer and irrigation ends up being around about another 112 petagrams of carbon. Interestingly, because we're now fertilizing and irrigating these areas, we have much higher net primary productivity. So we're actually drawing more carbon down into our crop area. So it sort of balances itself out. So it's like you've got to work out these components. So it's not just necessarily, you see this difference and say, oh, that would be a huge land cover impact. But because we have so much more productivity in a lot of our crop areas than we would have in the grasslands that they were previously there, we draw more carbon down before we lose that carbon back out. So going to the biogeophysics now, we can start thinking about, well, what do the differences in leaf area index look like? What does the impact on temperatures look like? And so we have these key areas where we have large land cover change occurring. And if you look at South America, we see this big deforestation in the Atlantic forests, and you see there's a warming and a decrease in LAI in that area. But if you go to North America and you look at sort of into the through the Midwest and into Canada, we have a lot of irrigation, we have like higher albedo, and in those areas we end up with cooling. We can start thinking about also thinking how we go forward in time. So here we have SSP 370, which I showed you was the one which had the big deforestation element to it, has this big expansion in croplands. And we can do that same experiment we did with the historical, which was the red and the green, but now we have this yellow, which is what happens with no land use, with much higher CO2 elevations, versus what happens if you have land use and land cover change going. And you can see that in that process, we now end up with 180 petagrams of carbon difference between those two. So that's in addition to all the fossil fuel emissions that would have happened as we went out to 2100 on this high emission pathway. We can also see where that carbon is being taken out. And you see the Congo and the Amazon are two areas where we see large scale deforestation and large carbon losses. But we also see the Eastern US as another area and areas through Southeast Asia. Okay, I have more slides, but I'm gonna actually call it here because I think for time, what we'd like to do is perhaps move on to Jackie's talk, and she's going to give you some great ideas about ecosystem demography and fire and how they work in like our model. But I will stay here and open it up for questions if people have some questions now.
I had a quick question about the future scenarios you showed for forest cover.
Yeah.
Why is SSP 585, what is it, higher than SSP 37? Because isn't it more extreme emission scenario? Or is it like CO2 fertilization, or is it just also land covers?
Right.
Different in that
scenario? So actually we'll do this one here. That's probably the easiest. So
right
the idea of the socioeconomic pathways is that there are different competing elements to them. So population is one big component of them. So SSP 585 is a very high emissions pathway, but it is actually a low population growth and it's high tech dependency. So people get rich, they just don't care about emissions. You know, they basically they figure, well, we'll just adapt. You know, we'll put air conditioning units in everywhere. We'll keep our fossil fuel emissions going high. But because you don't have that many people and you've got high tech change, and there's good trade, what happens is there's not a large need for increased cropping land. And they don't have any biofuels, or they don't look at other elements as well. So that's why, you know, it's sort of like, it's almost like it goes down a little bit and then comes back up. It's just basically because the population dynamics say we don't need to have large areas. Whereas in SSP 370, it's a very high population growth. It's also a breakdown of international trade. And so you have a lot of regional, and that's why the Congo and the Amazon get cleared to a large extent, is because you have these, I guess, sort of regional dependencies on increasing cropping areas. And, you know, it's also a high emission scenario, so they're not really dealing with like doing reforestation or afforestation. So it's a combination of multiple things inside the scenario, but it's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. So my question is about wetlands, and I'm wondering if wetlands drying, which can become a important source of greenhouse gases emissions, is considered in your study or not really?
So within CSM, we have a number, well, there is an active, obviously, hydrology, but wetland distributions are not actually prescribed. So what happens, they're interactively part of the water table depth. We have a methane model in CTSM. This is an area where we need a lot more development. And I know that your lab is looking at a lot at both capturing river transport, but also lakes, and the ability to represent the hydrology with much more fidelity. One of the key components of that is going to be, as you say, the carbon cycle within wetlands and those areas as they dry out, or as they change, what is the methane cycle, or what is the carbon breakdown. So just as we have, like, as permafrost is making carbon more available for decomposition and respiration, same sort of thing should be happening in wetlands. So this is an area that we would really like to have much further development. And it was actually a key element we talked about at the at the biogeochemistry working group meeting back in February. So, I'm sorry, March. So we were saying, yes, this is an active area that needs to be focused on. So it's a great question.
Thank you. I have another question if we have time.
Of course.
I'm interested in groundwater expansion, maybe dominated by, for example, the need for irrigation in the future. So the fact that you have scenarios for crop land expansion, this is very interesting. And I'm just wondering, how did you manage to make it realistic? For example, in terms of the location of this expansion, did you consider it, for example, the local availability of water, the soil type, things like that, which, maybe the physiography of the land?
Right.
Did you consider these factors into making these projections more realistic? Thank you.
No, that's a great question. So, so the couple model in a comparison project and land use model in a comparison project follows through on a harmonization of a number of integrated assessment models that have these scenarios. Each integrated assessment model has its own land use projections and land use models. And some of them do take into account arability, like access to irrigation, those sorts of things, and also tech change in terms of technology change in terms of farming practices. For our study, we look at what crops could be grown in that particular area based on where they historically were grown and the climate. So that's basically how we contain it. We directly take the irrigation demand and distributions from these integrated assessment models. So there isn't like that check in that whole process. Does this make sense? I've done quite a bit of reforestation, afforestation, and in those elements, we definitely looked at agricultural land, we looked at climate, we looked at suitability for growing trees. But that's a different set of runs from what we have with CMIP6 and the CSM out of the box land use trajectories. So great question. Obviously, the more information we bring in, the more realistic, the better the scenarios are.
Thank you very much.
Right.